Chapter 1. Introduction: Shattering the Illusion. When one mentions a medieval knight, the image that immediately comes to most minds is often a majestic figure in gleaming armor, riding a towering horse, holding a long lance, dominating the battlefield, or appearing in the colorful pageantry of tournaments. We easily imagine a romantic scene where honor, loyalty, and love are celebrated as supreme values, where men in shining armor throw themselves into ideals for a lady or for their homeland. This image has been nurtured through novels, poems, and ballads passed down over centuries, embedding itself in our collective memory as if it were self-evident. But reality, the stark, tedious reality, is completely different, and perhaps precisely because it is so far from this ideal, people needed illusions to cover it up, to make that world more acceptable, more beautiful, more poetic. In truth, armor seldom gleams, horses smell of sweat and dung, and knights spend most of their time not fighting, not wooing, not rescuing princesses, but sitting in cold castles yawning from boredom, or arguing over money. If you could turn back time and step into a feudal castle, you would quickly notice this difference. The musty smell of stone walls, the smoke from the kitchen clinging to fabrics, the stable's scent weaving through the corridors, all blend into a distinctive, hardly pleasant odor. Instead of meditating on honor, a knight might be bent over scratching an itchy wool garment or complaining to his wife about the year's poor tax harvest. The battles they frequently took part in were not legendary wars against foreign invaders, but often just minor border disputes with neighboring lords, lasting several days, ending with a few stolen cows, a few burnt houses, and villagers taken hostage for ransom. Honor, ideals, glory. All those beautiful words in books are distorted in reality into matters of profit, calculation, and sometimes merely pastimes to alleviate boredom. Most illusions of knights come from literature and oral stories passed down through generations, where storytellers tend to omit dull details and embellish sparkling ones. A low-ranking soldier dying of disease in a camp would never be mentioned, but a knight falling in a minor skirmish could be elevated to a tragic hero in a ballad by the fire. Layer by layer, the dust of legend accumulates over the years, obscuring a truth that is far from fascinating. For truth is usually boring. Long days without battles, weeks spent checking food stores, cleaning armories, supervising serfs, and listening to priests preach. If you imagine a knight always mounted, lance at the ready, charging into the smoky battlefield, the reality is that he often squats in the castle yard, chin in hand, awaiting news from outside or listening to repetitive tales of crop failure. Gleaming armor? Yes, it might shine if one spent a whole day polishing it with oil and coarse cloth, but most of the time it is covered in rust, dirt, and dents from previous collisions. Horses racing like the wind? In reality, most horses spend the day pulling loads, standing in cramped stables, eating dry hay, and occasionally getting annoyed by a clumsy page brushing their coat. Heroic tournaments? Most contests were internal training exercises, leaving nothing but a few bruises, some loose teeth, and several days of lingering discomfort. Many knights never set foot on a real battlefield, yet in family stories and official records, they are portrayed as courageous warriors, because the truth no one wanted to hear was that a knight could live his whole life without ever participating in a proper fight. And the deeper we dig, the more we realize that the concept of honor, so often sanctified, was actually just a facade for power and property relationships. A knight fought for a lord not necessarily out of loyalty, but because otherwise he would lose land, income, and even his existence within the system. Loyalty was essentially an exchange: protect the castle to be fed, maintain status to continue collecting taxes from serfs. Beautiful, perhaps if seen through the lens of literature, but in reality it was a harsh labor contract, where disobedience could mean death or oblivion. If you stepped into the great hall of a castle, instead of the grandeur shown in romantic paintings, you would see a different reality. High ceilings coated in dust, cold stone walls, narrow windows letting in little light, smoke staining the air. Any carpets, if present, were worn, dirty and musty. Long tables rarely hosted feasts, serving mostly hard bread and weak beer. Occasionally there was a grand feast, and it is these rare moments that literature records, while 99% of the mundane days are ignored, because no one wants to write about ordinary days spent chewing hard bread and exchanging bored glances. Nights in such a setting were not heroes you imagined. They sat, sometimes scowling, sometimes weary, thinking about unpaid debts, failed crops, and how to feed their horses as hay grew scarce. In those moments, honor meant little more than keeping up appearances with those around them, preserving a name in political negotiations. Outside, peasants ploughed poor fields, paying heavy taxes to support the system, while knights were depicted as their protectors. But in reality, knights were often the greatest threat. They could enter villages, seize food, force peasants to work without pay, or even extort property if the lord required. All in the name of protection, yet that protection was like a torn suit of armor, worn for show, unable to shield anyone. People endured not out of trust, but because they had no choice. Thus the noble image of knights is not just an illusion, but a deliberate distortion keeping the power system running smoothly and the lower ranks obedient. The irony is that, over time, the knights themselves began to believe in this illusion. They retold embellished stories to each other, repeated minor achievements as though they were great feats, wrote home claiming courageous battles, when in reality it was a trivial skirmish by the river. This self-deception became part of their identity, a dim mirror to reflect upon, believing themselves truly noble. And so society together built a beautiful story, while reality was dusty, musty, smelly, and full of tedium. Looking at the whole picture, we realize that the so-called Age of Knights was not a series of heroic adventures, but a slow, monotonous, harsh life, disguised by occasional fleeting brilliance. Later generations remembered only those flashes like lightning in the night sky, forgetting that most of the sky remained dark and heavy. For the majority of the time, a knight was a land manager, a supervisor of serfs, a tax collector, a man listening for hours to petty disputes over a neighbor's cow eating grain. Occasionally they rode out, not to rescue princesses, but to coerce peasants, or engage in small skirmishes unknown beyond the neighboring village. Yet after centuries, these dull details were omitted, leaving only a few shining pages, causing modern observers to sigh in admiration. The image of the knight in today's popular culture, shining armor, glimmering sword, loyal heart, is the result of deliberate selection. It is like a trimmed painting, shadows removed, points of light kept, then magnified to obscure everything else. But if we truly want to understand, to look directly, we must accept the fact that being a knight was hard labor, a bound existence, a life more boring than heroic. And perhaps it is precisely this boredom that is essential. It stretches on, repeats lulls everyone, making those involved gradually forget that they are trapped. So, before we step into the detailed story of a knight's life, let us set aside the beautiful illusions. Let us temporarily forget the knights in poetry and films. Instead, prepare for a slow, tedious journey full of dust, sweat, and yawns. Because that is the truth. And this truth, repeated rhythmically, can make anyone's eyelids heavy, like rain falling evenly on a tiled roof, like a wheel turning endlessly, slow yet infinite. This will be a story not meant to excite, but to lull you to sleep, much like the life of a knight who lulled himself day by day through meaningless hours. Chapter 2, A Childhood Stolen. Childhood of a knight, if one can even call it childhood, was in reality a series of days stolen from the embrace of family and thrown against the cold walls of a castle that was not their own. Mornings began with the crowing of roosters echoing from damp stables, mingling with the pungent scent of horse dung. At 7, a child was torn from innocent play and transformed into a tiny machine, capable of holding a mop, carrying a bucket of water, obeying orders, and forbidden to complain. One might have thought they would learn letters and words, but in truth all they learned was silence, clenching their lips when shouted at, standing for hours just to hand a cup of wine to a fat, red-faced, drunken master, who would laugh boisterously during the feast. People often called this training, a form of noble education to prepare the child for knighthood. But the raw truth was far simpler. Unpaid labor, a phase where adults exploited childhood strength for tasks no one else wanted to do, disguised in fancy words but in essence a kind of forced labor. Imagine a small boy on a winter morning, shivering in a threadbare sweater, hands red from the cold, carrying buckets of water from a deep well. Sometimes the rope would fray, cutting into the skin just to provide water for the master to wash his face. Too cold and he would be scolded. Too warm and he would still be scolded. Late by even a moment and a slap could follow. The boy swallowed his tears, for crying meant trouble. And trouble meant punishment. Then came the chores. Leading the horses out of the stalls, brushing them, picking up dung, sweeping, while the horses kicked mud onto him, and the stench never left his clothes. Then came the polishing of armor, rusty, heavy plates that had to shine brightly for the master's appearance, while the boy could only see his distorted reflection in the metal, a blurred image of a child being swallowed by a world stripped of innocence. Childhood. A soft, warm word evoking laughter, afternoon naps in fields, sticky fingers from sneaking honey in the kitchen did not exist for those destined to become knights, or if it did, it had been cut, distorted, transformed into something unrecognizable, a life of servitude. At 7, while ordinary children were making wooden swords for mock battles, the small boy of noble lineage, or at least connected, family, was lifted onto a horse by his parents and sent to a distant castle to begin his life as a page, a title that sounded sweet but in reality meant servitude, running errands, cleaning, learning obedience. Farewells were swift. Parents knew it was the only path for their child to gain a chance at rank, though that chance was as thin as a thread, often leading nowhere but a lifetime as a servant. Upon entering the castle gates, the boy was greeted not by the scent of his mother's hair, but by damp stone, horse dung, smoke from the kitchen, and the cold power of his new masters. Days began before dawn. He dragged water from the deep well, hands trembling, rope burning his skin, led horses out, brushed them, picked up manure, cleaned the arena, polished armor, until his reflection revealed only a tired child with dark circles under his eyes. Meals were a test. Pour the wine quickly enough, bring dishes promptly, clean the floor spotless. Any spilled drop could result in a slap or kick, and the boy learned to stare at his hands until they stopped trembling. He learned silence, standing motionless for hours, biting his teeth through pain, cleaning without leaving a trace, breathing softly to avoid trouble, watching everything while pretending not to notice anything. This peculiar education was designed to erase the self, to make a tool, to replace childish dreams with instincts of obedience. Rare moments of pride, touching a sword, riding an old horse, were immediately squashed by shouts. "Put that down! Clean this!" Dreams snuffed out like a candle blown out. Legends circulated of pages who fell asleep holding torches, catching fire in their hair, becoming the joke of the feast, or of children falling asleep while guarding horses in winter, forced to stand naked in snow to learn discipline. These were not myths, they were reality, monotonous, cruel, repeated enough to lull anyone listening into a drowsy stupor, as it did the pages themselves, collapsing onto straw at the end of the day, eyes closing with no thought for tomorrow. For tomorrow was merely a copy of today, today a copy of yesterday, extending endlessly until the boy reached the age for squire training, where more lashes, harsher trials and less sleep awaited, carrying the burden of a completely stolen childhood, a being neither child nor fully adult, living in the shadow of cold stone walls. Childhood dragged on like a bad dream with no ending, and paradoxically its monotony shaped the character of those later called nights. Each morning the boy reminded himself he was no longer at home. No mother's voice, no scent of baking bread, only smoke and grease in the great hall, where masters and guests feasted drunkenly while he cleaned silently. Each meal was a test: pour wine, deliver dishes, scrub floors, all under threat of punishment. Days of outdoor training under older nights meant collecting swords, setting up wooden targets, and sometimes becoming a moving target for mock attacks. A wooden sword swinging, a shield thrown for fun, leaving bruises for a week. Falling into mud, he was forbidden to cry, only to rise and smile through pain. Knights laughed, saying, "This child will make a man," but they merely entertained themselves with his suffering. Meals offered scraps at best, a piece of bread or leftover porridge, joy measured by survival, not delight. Night brought more labor, cleaning floors, gathering bones, scrubbing spilled wine, disposing of vomit. Exhausted, the boy finally returned to a corner of straw with other pages, smelling sweat, feet, and mold, too tired to notice. Sleep was dreamless. Exhaustion stole even dreams. Winter brought bitter cold, standing by the hearth to tend fire, carrying heavy wood, feet bare on icy floors. Summer brought suffocating heat, the smell of sweat in armor, polishing harder than ever. Worse than physical labor was the theft of joy. No games, no laughter, no freedom, only obedience, only the repetitive survival routine. Childhood vanished piece by piece, replaced by habits of servitude, reflexes of avoiding blows, cleaning skills, and invisibility. At 14, promotion to squire meant heavier training. Real wooden swords, riding in the arena, bruises, sleepless nights. Childhood was gone, leaving only a small, hardened body, a silent soul, eyes trained to look down. This was called adulthood, but it was merely forced maturation. No joy, no happiness, only obedience and labor. Before a knight could swing a sword or ride a horse, he had been a page, polishing shoes, cleaning dung, collecting vomit, swallowing tears. This foundation, the so-called glory of knighthood, was built on filth, stink, and tedium, enough to make any listener sigh and drift into sleep, as those pages drifted on to straw after endless days. The cycle repeated, day after day, year after year, like the steady beat of a drum in an endless song, numbing the senses, weighing down the mind. Pages lost all sense of holidays or rest. Only days of heavier labor existed. Festivals increased work, running errands, serving tables, cleaning, enduring pranks from drunk nobles. Adults laughed, music played, while children stooped to pick crumbs, mop spills, and when guests departed, real work began. Cleaning until near dawn. A child might fall asleep on the floor, only to be awakened by a slap and forced to continue until the stone shone. Thus, pages learned the art of invisibility, a survival skill absent from any book. Masters entered. The children knew to step aside, lower their gaze, remain silent. Called, they had to appear immediately. Not needed, they vanished. This skill, ironically, became essential in later knighthood, surviving battle unnoticed, serving lords without leaving a trace. Praised as loyalty, it was really the result of years of stolen childhood, where existence meant obedience and speaking meant trouble. Long winter days brought colds so severe that breath turned to mist. Pages huddled in the kitchen for warmth, only to be forced to carry heavy wood for the fire. Comfort was never for them, only for those seated in robes, sipping warm wine. Summer heat brought suffocating castles, sweaty armor, and heavier cleaning. Worst of all was the loss of joy. Children in villages ran freely. Pages ran only from well to kitchen, stable to hall, every step tied to command. No games, no reward beyond avoiding blows, no dreams except a few more moments of sleep. At 14, deemed mature, the boy became a squire. But maturity meant deeper servitude, training in combat, enduring stronger blows, waking earlier, sleeping less. His body, familiar with bruises and falls, now faced gashes and aching from wooden swords and long rides. Days repeated like polished stone, edges worn away, personality eroded. Society disguised forced labor as honor, childhood theft as the knight's path, a road paved with mud, horse dung, and sleepless nights. And if you are still awake hearing this, your eyelids may grow heavy, for the monotony of endless repetition hypnotizes you as it did the pages of old, turning thoughts into weary echoes, sinking slowly into silence. Like those children, after a day of cleaning, after a night of cold, they fell onto straw, eyes closing, knowing nothing of the world, only deep, dreamless sleep, without hope, without childhood. Chapter 3. The brutal training. If the stage of being a page had been enough to make a child forget that it had once been a child, the next stage, becoming a trainee, was when the body and spirit that remained were ruthlessly sharpened, dragged across the muddy training yard, beaten until bruised, and all of this was given a pretty name, training. People said this was an important period to turn a boy into a knight, but in reality it was nothing more than a long series of days drained of life, a forced labor program disguised as martial education and honor. From the age of 14 onward, a boy was no longer just cleaning and serving. He was thrown into grueling training sessions from dawn until darkness fell. And if you imagine any heroism in it, cast it aside, what truly existed was sweat, mud, the shouts of instructors, and the sound of bones striking wood. Mornings began by dragging a body still aching from a night spent on straw straight to the training yard, where the mist covered the ground and the bare feet of trainees left cold, muddy footprints. The first exercise was usually running laps, not to build endurance as modern training books might suggest, but to prove that those who lagged would be struck on the back with a stick. Each lap brought ragged breaths and pounding hearts, yet no one cared about heart rate or physical limits. The only limit was the tolerance of the lash. Exhaustion was just the beginning, for then came weapons training. Heavy, rough wooden swords were designed not to be beautiful, but to hurt. The swings were never gentle. The instructor cared not for technique at first, only for how long a child could withstand blows before falling. And so young trainees swung at each other, wood clashing, bruises spreading across arms, shoulders, and sides, and if anyone fell, they were immediately yelled at, "Stand up! A knight never falls," a phrase that sounded heroic, but was really just an order, forcing an exhausted body to repeat meaningless motions. Exercises followed one another like an endless sequence of punishments. Wooden swords gave way to heavy shields, running laps to rope climbing, falling to getting back up, and the instructor always had an excuse to shout, lash, or throw in more challenges. If a trainee fell in the mud, he was forced to do push-ups on the damp ground, hands sliding, knees smeared, with no mercy, only the mocking laughter of those above. Each day, mud became a close companion, sweat a second skin, and wounds familiar ornaments. The so-called training was really a process of hardening the body, removing softness, turning it into unyielding flesh, regardless of pain, exhaustion, or a spirit long shattered. Children learn to hold swords not to perform beautifully, but to survive. They learn to ride, not to gallop heroically, but to avoid falling and being trampled. All of it unfolded in an atmosphere thick with shouts, clanging iron, neighing horses, ragged breathing, and hearts pounding like war drums in young chests. Some days, the children were forced to wear heavy armor while training. Armor, already uncomfortable for a grown knight, was nearly unbearable for a trainee's still developing body. Each step was heavy, feet sinking into mud, shoulders aching as if breaking under the weight, breath choked by heat. When sweat soaked through, it smelled sour and metallic. Some would stagger and fall, unable to rise, while the instructor laughed coldly. On the battlefield, falling means death. So they struggled like overturned beetles, sometimes helped, sometimes left to wriggle until exhaustion. The lesson was simple: never fall. But how could one avoid falling when the body was bound in metal, legs not yet accustomed to supporting its own weight? And still they fell, stood, fell again, stood again, repeating until the will dulled, until the mind only obeyed, thoughtless, evening. When the body might hope for rest, brought night watch exercises. A trainee had to stand still in darkness for hours, holding a spear, eyes wide, ears straining for sound, body trembling from cold. A brief blink, and punishment followed. Some knelt on stones until morning, knees bleeding. Some wore armor all night to cultivate patience. Some were starved for dozing. Night followed night, sleep a luxury, rest a dream. Trainees gradually understood that their bodies no longer belonged to them. They belonged to the instructor, to harsh orders, to a system that knew no mercy. Days stretched like an endless iron chain. The echo in their heads became the repetitive commands. Faster, stronger, endure. Repeated until it merged with their breathing, a wordless refrain of exhaustion and pain. Eventually they could no longer tell ordinary days from holidays, today from yesterday, all indistinguishable, all submerged in mud and sweat. Training with wooden swords blistered their hands. Skin burst, blood flowed, yet they had to grip on, for letting go meant punishment. With shields, shoulders ached, muscles trembled, yet arms remained raised, for lowering them meant the lash. Riding horses they fell, pain shooting, sometimes breaking limbs, yet they had to get up, for lying down invited mockery from the yard. No place existed for weakness or mercy, only repetition until numbness, only exhaustion becoming instinct. Occasionally, mock duels were staged to acquaint trainees with combat. Mock meant no steel, but everything else was real. Real strikes, real blows, real bruises. Two children charged, sticks clashing, sweat flying, gasps escaping, and the one who fell had to rise and continue until both collapsed in mud, hands unable to move. Instructors observed and nodded. Good, now accustomed to pain. Pain was a skill to be learned, endurance the ultimate goal. Indeed, in this world, endurance was the key. Those who could bear more survived, those who could not perished or quit. Quitting, however, was never admitted. Cowards were shamed, expelled from the path of knighthood, and so the children, even with broken bones and bleeding, gritted their teeth, bit lips to the point of bleeding, and made no sound. In the rare moments of rest by the hearth, their gaze wandered, staring at flames like sleepwalkers. They no longer spoke, no longer laughed, their strength drained, their minds eroded. What they called rest was merely a brief pause before being thrown back into training. Meals were little better: hard bread, thin gruel, occasional scraps of meat, enough to avoid starvation, never enough for satiety. Hunger became constant, paradoxically making their bodies lighter to run, weaker to fight, but no one cared. The goal was not health, but absolute obedience. On rainy nights, the training yard became a quagmire, yet the schedule never stopped. Trainees plunged into mud, fell and rose, mud covering their faces, slipping into mouths and noses, yet none could wipe it away. The instructor only smirked. Battlefields are never sunny for you. And so, the children learned to endure cold, filth, falling and rising in mud, until their bodies could no longer distinguish skin from earth. In those days, self-awareness faded, leaving only repetition. Raise shield, swing sword, fall, rise, breathe. Repeat, a cycle consuming the youth that should have been playful. Each year, the number of trainees dwindled. Some ran away, some fell ill, some collapsed in the yard and died. No one cared. The law here was natural selection. The weak eliminated, the strong survived. And the survivors gained nothing but continued erosion, continued shaping into instruments. Outsiders saw heroic training, young men riding horses and swinging swords, imagining glory. Inside, it was a long, endless imprisonment, the body shackled by discipline, the spirit worn down by cold commands. When the body grew accustomed to pain, numb to fatigue, fearless, the soul lost its dreams. No one remembered green meadows, no one imagined lost childhood, no one retained innocent smiles. All became cold faces, empty eyes, heavy steps. And that was the desired outcome, people ready to obey, ready to fight, ready to die without asking why. Brutal training called glory was in truth a mill grinding dreams, laughter, breath, leaving only flesh capable of wielding a sword. And if you sit listening, you may feel its monotonous rhythm creep into your mind, like a melody without tune, like a distant drum, slow, steady, repeating, making your eyelids heavy, your breathing slow. You may feel yourself running laps, swinging swords, falling, rising, and then, like the trainees of old, you will cease thinking, letting your body sink, heavy, deep, into sleep. Chapter 4. Armor and Weapons Armor. Well, who wouldn't think of armor when mentioning knights? That dazzling, shiny image reflecting sunlight across a smoke-filled battlefield has mesmerized generations of people in later times. But if someone in the Middle Ages had the chance to hear such poetic descriptions, they would probably just smirk and scratch a patch of rust at the elbow. Because armor is not glamorous at all. It is heavy, rigid, confining, and most importantly, it exhausts a person even before the battle begins. A young knight, when trying on his first suit of armor, often feels as if he is transforming into a walking metal barrel. If he had secretly dreamed of becoming magnificent and imposing, after a few cumbersome steps, sweat pouring down, knees creaking, he would realize, this is not a dream, this is a metal nightmare. But let us slow down a bit. Do not rush into those weary, clanging sounds just yet. Armor, like everything else in life, has undergone a long and tedious evolution. At first, knights had nothing more than a thick garment made of rough fabric, sometimes padded with flax or cotton to soften the blow of a blade. This was called a gambeson. The wearer might feel warm in winter, but when summer arrived, oh dear, soaked in sweat, with a sour stench rising, enough to make even the warhorse recoil. Then, because humans are never satisfied, they began adding chainmail. Small iron rings linked together to form a heavy mesh covering the body. From afar it looked impressive, like a living steel block. But in reality, wearing it for a single morning made the knight's shoulders feel like they were carrying 2 boulders. And the rattling sound when moving, like a cat wearing bells in the night, alerted enemies from afar without the need for scouts. Finally, in the knightly golden age, plate armor appeared. This is what later generations associate with the shining knight, carefully forged steel plates, curved, riveted, hinged, strapped with leather, fitting snugly to the body. Armor craftsmanship had advanced so far that a suit could fit each joint precisely, offering protection while still allowing movement. at least enough to lift an arm to eat a piece of meat. But in truth, such movements were slow, arduous, and each motion was an endless negotiation with gravity. It is said that a fully armored knight could carry an extra 20 to 30 kilograms. This may seem insignificant, but try carrying a 30-kilogram sack of rice all day, then mount a horse, sit upright, raise your sword, and wait for the trumpet signal. You would understand why knights often died from exhaustion more than from an enemy's blade, and armor never traveled alone. It always came with weapons, a loyal yet cursed companion. Knightly weapons were as varied as their moods: long swords, short swords, spears, maces, axes, lances. Swords are often romanticized: the sword of justice, the sword of honor. But let's be honest, a sword is merely a sharpened piece of metal used to cut, stab, slash, and draw blood. Honor exists only in glorifying books. In reality, a sword does not hesitate to turn a person into a bloody log. Long swords are impressive, but heavy and cumbersome. Short swords are handy, but lack reach. A long lance works well when charging on horseback, but once dropped, it becomes an unwieldy stick. Maces, well, a mace doesn't require skill, just arm strength. But imagine swinging a mace while wearing 30 kilograms of armor, sweat pouring, breath heaving. You'll see that the mace is no longer romantic. It is a weighted club that can hit the opponent, or accidentally yourself. Alas, armor and weapons are inseparable from a knight's life. From the morning struggle of being strapped in by a squire to the exhausted night of peeling off every iron piece, shoulders and back sore, skin scratched, sitting like a snail stripped of its shell. And then, the next day, the loop begins again. Once donned, a knight becomes a prisoner of his own armor. Simple tasks, sitting on a chair, bending to pick up something, or even using the toilet, become grueling missions. Later generations may marvel at knights galloping on horseback, but they forget that before mounting the horse, the knight had to fumble, bend knees, brace hands, and often rely on a few squires to push from behind. And if he falls, yes, it is a comical tragedy. The knight resembles a flipped turtle, struggling hopelessly, rolling back and forth, emitting pitiful clanging noises. The attendants, called squires, knew this reality well. Every morning they spent nearly an hour fastening straps, locking buckles, attaching each piece of armor to the knight's body. Each piece had to be positioned perfectly, otherwise knees could not bend, elbows could not lift, or the chest was so constricted that breathing became labored. Sometimes a knight would just step onto the battlefield, only to have to redo the straps amid trumpet signals. Anyone who has worn armor understands a single mistake can turn an entire day into hell. Another major problem was the heat. A steel plate armor had no concept of breathable. Under the scorching sun, inside it felt like a steam oven. Sweat poured out with nowhere to escape, soaking the inner gambeson. The smell, combined with metal and animal fat used to maintain the armor, created a pungent stench even hunting dogs would avoid. It was said that after days of marching, the armor could become so damp that if left overnight, mold could grow inside. Yet the knight still had to crawl into it, as if climbing into a walking coffin. Then there was maintenance. Armor, if worn, quickly rusted. Steel in those days had no anti-rust coating. To keep it shiny, squires had to spend hours rubbing oil into every plate. This labor was as exhausting as battle. When it rained, a knight's spirit sank. Not because of slippery roads, but because tomorrow would mean hours of scraping rust. Sitting there, staring at reddish streaks spreading across the armor, was like witnessing the erosion of one's own lifespan. Weapons, too, required care. A sword, if not regularly sharpened, became a dull piece of metal, clanging uselessly against enemy armor. Spears could break, wooden shafts warp from sun and rain. Maces and axes, seemingly crude, could splinter, sending blades flying mid-battle. A knight had to trust that his weapon would not betray him in the decisive strike. Yet countless tragedies occurred, swords breaking mid-combat, spearheads flying off, maces hitting their own horse. Everything could end in a stunned disbelief. When discussing swords, we must mention the so-called sword of honor. Many noble families regarded a sword as an heirloom, engraved with names or coats of arms, sometimes even given a proper name. Later generations romanticized them with vague legends. But ask a knight, and he would likely chuckle. In reality, a sword is a tool, and tools break quickly. Often, a family sword was carried only for display at ceremonies. On the battlefield, a cheaper, ordinary sword was drawn, ready to be abandoned if escape was necessary. The irony, or more accurately, the tragedy, is that armor and weapons, made to protect and kill, sometimes became the burdens that killed their owners. A knight thrown into a river in 30 kilograms of armor had almost no chance of survival. For this reason, in many battles, soldiers often scavenged armor and weapons from fallen knights, rather than receiving them fresh from the forge. The corpse fell, the armor remained valuable, just needing rust scraped and minor repairs, and a new set was ready. Thus, in the weary loop of a knight's life, armor and weapons were both symbols of honor and daily torment. People may see them gleaming in paintings, but up close one would see sweat, smell, bruises on shoulders, and the exhausted eyes peeking through the visor. That is the truth. Slow, heavy, and rusty. If you think armor is only useful on the battlefield, you are mistaken. Outside war, knights also participated in tournaments called jousts or melees, where honor, money, and sometimes life itself were at stake. These contests were like slow torture performances, where knights clad in heavy armor, holding swords or spears, rode horses screaming into opponents. Imagine this scene. Two knights charge at each other at moderate speed, enough to feel the armor's weight, the sword's resistance, and tension in every muscle. A slight collision is enough to jolt the shoulders, make wrists ache, sometimes causing the warrior to slip from the saddle, landing amid the crowd's fearful and excited cheers. Yes, this is not war. Yet the body suffers as if facing actual death. Weapons in these contests also reveal their absurdity. Spears meant to strike the enemy horse could become comical if one's own horse did not cooperate, charging into obstacles, being thrown aside, or staggering across the arena. Swords, celebrated as swords of justice, were often dulled in tournaments, but that did not reduce their weight or handling difficulty. Maces and axes, even when decorative, still posed injury risks to both sides. Armor, in tournaments, often proved useless. A knight swinging a spear could have the steel shoulder plate fail, rattling, loosening, throwing off balance, or upon falling, the rigid armor prevented the body from flexing with the ground, causing bruises, scratches, or even broken bones. Armor, imagined as salvation, in reality both protected and tormented, turning the knight into a heavy puppet in the arena. Even in daily training, knights realized the unreasonable limits of weapons and armor. Hours-long practice in armor, from loose steel to perfect fitting, brought fatigue, aching shoulders, and weary backs. Each practice strike or thrust reminded that weapons are not always useful, and armor does not always save lives. ChatGPT Jun Noi. Chapter 5. The Reality of War. War does not begin with a swinging sword or the blare of triumphant horns. It begins with dragging footsteps along muddy roads, the chill seeping into your bones before dawn, the thick scent of sweat, horse fat, and damp earth. A night wakes in the camp, where the groans of comrades mingle with the rattling of armor being adjusted one last time. The armor, heavy as it is, has become both a companion that protects and a tormentor that confines. The attendants, squires, hustle to lift each plate onto shoulders, fasten straps, check weapons. Every morning, a knight undergoes a slow, exhausting metal bath, feeling each vibration along the shoulders as the buckles bite into flesh. Even holding a sword, raising a spear, or gripping a shield is strenuous work, as muscles have yet to warm, and sweat and grease make hands slippery, making weapons nearly impossible to hold. Marching to the battlefield is no less challenging. Horses weary, bellies empty, hooves sinking in mud. Knights fatigued, shoulders aching, backs sore. Soldiers around them trudging, complaining, sometimes quarreling. Every hour, fatigue seeps into every small detail. The clanging of armor, the weighty footsteps, the thundering of hooves on wet earth. There is no excitement here, only relentless drudgery and toil. When the enemy finally appears, a knight realizes that the real battlefield is a chaotic maze. Smoke, dust, blood, and sweat hang in the air, blurring everything. You cannot distinguish enemy from ally, dirt from mud, horse from human corpse. The first strike, imagined as heroic, is in reality a complex blend of physical and mental effort, maintaining balance, twisting the body against the armor's weight, all while trying to clearly spot the opponent. Every movement is heavy, hands tremble, legs ache, heart pounds. A missed swing, a slipping step, and the knight is in danger. The horse stumbles, dragging the heavy body, turning its rider from master to puppet. Personal skill under prolonged fatigue becomes limited. Survival depends on luck, instinctive reflexes, and endurance. A single lapse can end a life. A missed thrust can disrupt the entire formation. The battlefield is not beautiful or poetic. It is a grim mixture of exhausting sounds, smells, and slow, laborious motion. Rain, fog, slippery mud, horses slipping, armor pressing down. These make combat even harsher. There is no room for strategy or fancy techniques. Everything is distorted by physical reality and exhaustion. People often imagine nights glorious under a blazing sun, but in truth many battles occur under driving rain, boots and saddles caked in mud, armor smeared, weapons slick and hard to grip. A charge at the enemy becomes a farce if the horse slips, the body slides in the mud, or the sword falls. This chaos is multiplied by both allies and foes. Soldiers yell, collide, fall, get injured, creating chain reactions. A knight must protect himself, observe the environment, maintain weapons, and control the horse, all senses alert, but soon fatigued and sluggish. When the battle ends, a knight does not see victory, only exhaustion, aching muscles, body sore, armor caked in blood and mud. The dead lie scattered, horses fallen, the battlefield in disarray. The glories recorded in books now feel like heavy memories. The consequences of war persist. Aching muscles, sore joints with changing weather, mental stress, memories of corpses, screams, and chaos haunting the mind. Even survivors face an endless cycle. March, fight, fatigue, recover, march again. War is not glorious. It is endurance, a series of weary breaths, dragging steps through bloody mud, keeping body and mind upright. And when night falls, a knight sits in the silent battlefield, cleaning armor and sword, realizing that real war is an endless loop of pain, exhaustion, and quiet patience, a patience nobody celebrates, yet one that determines survival. The sun will rise again, and if alive, the knight will face another day with the same fatigue, the same toil, the same suffering, without any trace of grandeur. Chapter 6. Tournaments and Pastimes After War. A knight returned to what was thought to be a peaceful life, yet that peace was quickly replaced by tournaments, festivals and pastimes, a long, grueling cycle of ritualized challenges, exhausting yet draped in a veneer of glittering spectacle. Knighthood allowed no respite. Even with bodies worn to the bone, they had to participate for reputation, duty, and the expectant gaze of the nobility. Mornings began while dew still clung to the grass. The knight entered the armory, where dozens of gleaming pieces of metal lay neatly arranged. Donning armor was neither quick nor easy. Each plate, each heavy buckle stretched the body like a cumbersome machine. Shoulders, back, legs, arms all bore the weight, every step an effort, every breath tasting of the salty sweat soaked into the skin from the early hour.
Hands gripped swords, spears, axes or lances,
Trembling from fatigue, yet forced to hold steady, ready for the performances the knights called tournaments. Pre-tournament training was a repetitive, exhausting ordeal. Hours spent riding, practicing each charge, strike, and defense, pushing the body to its limits. Each swing, each melee exercise left bones aching, muscles taut and screaming. The mind grew weary as well, but rest was forbidden. Reputation and honor were the only rewards, tiny and insufficient compared to the toil endured. When the tournament began, the wide green field before the castle erupted in activity. Painted wooden fences, banners fluttering in the wind, blaring trumpets and drums. The audience cheered, clapped, yet no one saw the silent exhaustion in every breath, each slow step. Knights stepped onto the field like ancient machines, eyes glazed, yet maintaining an air of dignity, watching every move of their opponent. The joust, a mounted contest with lances, tested both body and mind. Each charge, each collision sent vibrations through ribs, the body swaying with the rhythm of the horse. Every fall, every impact against the heavy armor left shoulders, hips, and neck sore to the point that the knight felt as if he might shatter. Yet they had to rise, wipe fake blood, and charge again, for the crowd's cheers and noble gazes were invisible reminders that weakness was forbidden. Melee was chaotic, many knights colliding, pushing, grappling, falling, then rising again. Each impact throbbed painfully. Every gasp was the sound of utter exhaustion. But it had to continue, for honor and duty brooked no pause. In melee, victory mattered little. Endurance, survival, and maintaining dignity were the true measures, even as the body disintegrated under strain. Spectators saw none of the fatigue or aching. They saw banners fluttering, trumpets and drums, sunlight glinting off silvered armor, staged falls presented as spectacle, and prizes, gold, titles, praise as bait,
rendering everything glamorous, absurd, yet alluring. At festivals,
knights joined other games, spear-throwing, demonstration duels, playful horse races, all equally illogical. They plunged into the games, sweat-soaked, muscles aching, willpower strained. Everything was a performance. The audience laughed, cheered, enjoyed it, while the knight endured the endless loop of toil. The cacophony of cheers, drums, and trumpets created a wall of sound both stimulating and exhausting. Each victory was temporary showmanship, each defeat a mild humiliation, yet both painted with false glamour. Knights understood that tournament glory lay in endurance, survival, and maintaining dignity, not in actual triumph. In the evening, when the tournament ended, knights trudged back to the castle.
armor heavy as lead, weapons dusted with dirt and fake blood, bodies aching so that every step was a challenge.
They sat in the hall taking a small sip, watching colleagues laugh and joke, yet inside the fatigue, soreness, and absurdity of their illusory glory simmered, a reminder that tomorrow it would all begin again: armor, weapons, tournaments, audience prizes, and the endless grueling cycle. And so knights lived within the drawn-out whirl of tournaments and pastimes, a life appearing glorious, yet in truth a string of long, exhausting, absurd days, where outward dignity was maintained through pain, sweat, and spent strength. Glory was not something possessed, it was something endured and preserved, a destiny unavoidable. Chapter 7. daily meals. The morning in the castle began with dim light filtering through the high windows, casting its glow on the stone walls, the long polished tables, and the hard wooden chairs. The air still carried the scent of smoke from the fireplace of the previous night,
mingling with the stale aroma of the bread baked the day before,
creating a feeling that was at once familiar and dragging, simultaneously dull and exhausting. The knight tiptoed along the long corridor, his shoulders and back aching from the previous night, every step seeming to drag his heavy body, sinking his mind into a prolonged sense of drowsiness. The breakfast hall appeared. Long and narrow, the colleagues already gathered, their eyes both stern and scrutinizing. On the table, familiar dishes, hard bread, thin soup, tasteless meat. The blandness made eating a challenge for both body and mind. The knight sat down, chewing each piece of hard bread, sensing its bland taste and the soreness that ran from his back down to his legs. Every action was observed with meticulous scrutiny, a slightly loud chew, a gulp,
a hand touching the knife incorrectly. All could serve as reasons for one's honor to be assessed. Every breakfast was a prolonged ritual. Washing hands correctly, bowing in order, lifting the cup,
raising the plate, placing the knife precisely. The servants stood around, supervising every gesture, ready to remind if there was a slip. The knight chewed and sighed, his body sore, his mind dragging, and the sense of exhaustion and drowsiness increasing. Lunch took place in the main dining hall, sunlight slicing through the windows, stretching the shadows of columns and wooden chairs. The dishes remained bland, thin soup, tasteless meat, wilted vegetables. At the table, colleagues exchanged glances and subtle evaluations. The knight chewed while observing, realizing that every meal was a dragging loop. Honor, ritual, mutual scrutiny, all merged with fatigue, soreness, and boredom. In the afternoon, the light meal and tea ritual extended.
long and drawn out like a test of the spirit.
Hard pastries, weak tea, the rituals of placing the cup, pouring tea, bowing in thanks, all moved slowly, tediously. Colleagues and servants stood nearby, watching, reminding, maintaining strict formality. The knight chewed the pastry, sipped the tea, feeling his body weary, his back aching, shoulders heavy, his mind dragging, and the sense of drowsiness prolonging. Dinner represented the pinnacle of tediousness and absurdity. The dishes were elaborately prepared yet bland. The ritual extended further. Colleagues gathered, eating while exchanging glances, giving subtle judgments. The knight realized that everything, the meal, the ritual, the observing glances, was an endless loop, dragging, immersing the body and mind in exhaustion, soreness, boredom, and drowsiness. Throughout the day, the knight realized that all meals in the castle were not merely for nourishment. They were ritual, honor, mental pressure, social control. Each meal was a challenge, maintaining form, observing colleagues, following absurd rituals, chewing bland bread, sipping bland water, enduring bodily soreness and mental fatigue. When night fell, the knight returned to his room, removed his armor, placed everything on the rack, and sat for a moment to feel the accumulated soreness in his body, the mental exhaustion and the dragging boredom of the day. He closed his eyes, imagining tomorrow's meals, sensing the dragging, dull, absurd feeling again, extending and leading to drowsiness. Every meal was a dragging loop: hard bread, thin soup, tasteless meat, absurd ritual, observing glances,
False honor, all merged with fatigue.
boredom, soreness, prolonging day after day, week after week, year after year. The night became a weary machine, eating, chewing, swallowing, following form, and passing through the endless drowsiness of the castle. Chapter 8. The Castle and a Boring Life. The knight awoke to the faint morning light slipping through the castle windows, touching the long stone corridors, the high ceilings, and the cold walls that had absorbed countless years of repetition. Each step he took across the hallways felt heavier than the last, as if the stones themselves pressed down on his weary body. His shoulders ached from the habitual weight of armor, his back stiff from the years of practice and ceremony. He moved with the sluggish rhythm of someone whose body and mind were both steeped in exhaustion, dragging each limb as though time itself resisted his motion. Life in the castle was a loop of monotony. Each day presented the same endless sequence, the same corridors, the same faces, the same ceremonies. The knight observed his colleagues, some young, energetic, and eager, others similarly worn by years of repetition. All movements were measured, deliberate, restrained. Nothing escaped scrutiny, whether from senior knights, clerics, or attendants. Every act, from rising from a chair to gesturing while speaking, was performed in accordance with unspoken codes of honor, yet these codes often felt absurd, their logic opaque and wearying. Meals, as always, were long and tedious. The knight moved through each dining ritual with practiced precision, cutting the meat with a blade, dipping bread into the thin soup, lifting the cup with measured care. The flavor was insipid, the portions adequate but uninspiring, and the conversation minimal, broken only by the occasional correction or glance that reminded everyone of their place within the rigid social hierarchy. The fatigue was not merely physical. It extended into the very marrow of his mind. He chewed mechanically, swallowed reluctantly, and felt the weight of existence pressing down, a slow, unrelenting oppression that dulled the senses and pulled the spirit into lethargy. Training, too, had lost all vitality. The young knights practiced with vigor, their swords slicing through the air with precision and energy, their movements fluid and confident. The knight, older now, attempted to replicate them, only to find his strikes slow, his defense labored, and his endurance diminished. He watched silently, recognizing the shift. Once he had been the paragon of skill, admired and respected. Now he was a shadow, a relic whose presence evoked polite acknowledgement but little else. His body, though still capable, resisted the rigors of motion, and each swing of his sword was a reminder of diminishing power, an echo of past glory lost to the relentless march of time. Evenings were a succession of dull tasks and minor ceremonies. Walking the castle halls in the fading light, observing the moonlight stretching over stone pillars, hearing the wind whistle through cracks in the walls, the knight reflected upon the absurdity of his life. Honor, once a guiding principle, now felt hollow. Duty had become a burden, and the rituals that filled his days were exercises in futility. Every action, every repetition reinforced a sense of mechanical existence, a life consumed by routines that neither satisfied nor energized, only prolonged the sensation of tedious endurance by night. The knight returned to his quarters, removed the heavy armor, placed each piece meticulously on its rack, and sat. His body ached, his mind was exhausted, and the silence of the castle enveloped him. He thought of the days to come, the same corridors, the same meals, the same ceremonies. The monotony stretched endlessly before him, a pathway through which time moved sluggishly, a constant companion in the form of weariness and soporific discontent. Life in the castle was a labyrinth of boredom, repetition, and absurd ritual where the body ached, the mind dragged, and even the notion of honor felt like a hollow echo. Each day was another iteration of the same patterns, a relentless cycle from which escape seemed impossible. And the knight, like a machine worn by years of mechanical living, endured it all with quiet resignation, a participant in the tedious, soporific theatre of castle life. Chapter 9. Social Relations. Life within the castle continued in a rhythm both slow and oppressive, as though time itself had been stretched into long, taut strands that weighed upon every action. Social interactions were numerous yet profoundly tedious, an intricate dance of politeness, rivalry, subtle judgments, and the constant expectation of decorum. Each conversation demanded careful attention. Each gesture was scrutinized, every glance passed for hidden meaning. The knight, now older and considerably wearier, navigated these encounters with measured caution, conscious that even the smallest misstep might carry consequences, however minor or absurd they might seem to an outside observer. He observed his colleagues, some young and full of energy, others, like him, showing the gradual erosion of vitality that comes with years of routine and repetition. Every story recounted, every boast of past deeds or victories carried dual significance, outwardly a casual retelling, inwardly a claim to status, a silent challenge. The knight participated when required, nodding, speaking in measured tones, though increasingly the words felt hollow, devoid of the thrill or purpose they might once have carried. Ritualized greetings, formal acknowledgments, bows of respect, and subtle gestures of deference were performed with meticulous precision. Failure to observe these minutiae could provoke quiet ridicule or subtle social censure. The knight, his body now protesting every movement, performed these gestures mechanically. Pain radiated from his joints with every bow, his muscles ached with each extended hand, and every cautious step reminded him of the inexorable decline of his physical prowess. Social interactions, rather than invigorating or connecting, became yet another arena of fatigue, one more set of repetitive motions that added to the pervasive sense of exhaustion, boredom and mental weariness that dominated life in the castle. Even meals, gatherings and ceremonial events were drawn into this pattern of tedium. He engaged in polite conversation, nodded appropriately, and uttered phrases of acknowledgement that once conveyed energy and vigor, but now seemed forced and hollow. The social rituals, while outwardly benign, reinforced the same endless cycle that structured all aspects of life. Repetition, careful attention, and the maintenance of a symbolic hierarchy whose significance seemed increasingly abstract and wearying. Chapter 10. Religion and Superstition. The morning light crept slowly through the high, narrow windows of the castle, a pale, diffuse glow that barely reached the stone floor, touching the worn surfaces with a fragile, indifferent grace, highlighting the dust motes that hung in the air, suspended as if to mark the passage of time in silent, endless observation. The knight rose from his bed, each movement a negotiation between intention and the resistance of an aging body, joints stiff and aching from years of exertion and long nights spent in half-conscious vigilance, muscles protesting the very act of lifting limbs that once had moved with precision and power, now trembling with the weariness of decades. His armor, once a proud testament to skill and status, lay in pieces on the rack, polished but heavy, its cold metal reflecting the muted light in a way that reminded him of both past glory and present fragility, a dichotomy that had followed him through every hall and corridor since his youth. He dressed in garments that were rough, stiff, and ritualistically precise, every fold, seam, and button an echo of traditions handed down over centuries, a code of appearance that, like every other aspect of castle life, demanded absolute adherence. Each motion required concentration, a deliberate awareness that a single lapse could be noticed, recorded, judged, and subtly commented upon, all in the quiet, insinuating manner of those who had long since mastered the art of silent observation. The knight moved toward the chapel with measured steps, the echo of boots on stone reverberating through the long, empty corridors, a sound both familiar and oppressive, a reminder of the countless repetitions that had filled his days and nights, a rhythm that seemed to mock the passage of time itself with its inexorable insistence. The chapel doors, tall and solemn, loomed before him, their carved wooden surfaces bearing the marks of countless generations. the motifs worn into gentle abstraction by centuries of touch and attention. He entered slowly, feeling the chill of the stone floor seeping into his feet, the coldness a tactile reminder of the distance between the flesh and the idealized notions of strength. Devotion and honor he had once carried effortlessly. Candles flickered, their flames casting restless shadows on the walls, a dance that seemed to reflect the flickering of his own energy, once vibrant, now dimmed and hesitant. Incense filled the air, a thick, clinging scent that enveloped the senses, mingling with the faint odor of aged stone, wood, and human presence, a melange that reminded him simultaneously of sanctity, ritual, and the inescapable passage of time. The knight knelt on the cold floor, hands folded with deliberate precision, back erect though the effort brought sharp reminders of age and fatigue to every muscle along his spine. He recited prayers learned in boyhood, words flowing with mechanical familiarity, yet carrying the weight of centuries, the resonance of meaning dulled by repetition, their sacredness diluted by the endlessness of ritual. Each syllable demanded focus, each gesture required exactness, and any deviation risked subtle rebuke, a glance of disapproval, a whisper of moral judgment from the observing clergy or the equally vigilant fellow knights, whose presence added layers of psychological weight to the physical effort. The ceremony continued with a procession, a slow march around the chapel, steps measured, arms positioned according to protocol, heads lowered in strict observance. The knight's movements were ornamental, a shadow of the strength and agility he had once commanded, the energy of youth replaced by careful calculation and endurance of bodily protest.
Knees ached with each bend, shoulders protested each raise,
and every incremental motion reminded him of the relentless attrition of age, a corporeal echo of the erosion of skill and social standing that had accompanied him through years of service. Superstition infiltrated every gesture. The placement of candles, the order of prayers, the alignment of texts, even the sequence in which knights and clergy moved through the chapel were imbued with consequences both spiritual and social. Misalignment, error, or oversight could invite subtle criticism, whispers of moral lapse, or the quiet disapproval of peers, each instance magnified in significance by the weight of tradition. The knight, accustomed to the strictures of these practices,
moved with meticulous attention, his body protesting.
Yet his mind equally fatigued by the relentless layering of rules and the mental calculation of potential social or divine repercussions. Meals, when observed in the context of ritual and superstition, were themselves an extension of this exhaustive system. Bread, broken with precise care, wine poured in measured amounts, gestures of thanks performed in sequence, hands washed in ritual order. Every act was observed, repeated, and measured for adherence. The knight chewed mechanically, swallowing with deliberate care. Every motion a combination of necessity, endurance, and calculated appearance, the monotony pressing upon him as heavily as any armor he had worn in youth. Fatigue was pervasive, spreading from muscle to mind, each breath feeling heavier than the last. Each glance around the hall a reminder of social hierarchies and expectations that pressed silently upon every participant in the ceremony. Even the simplest interaction was complex. A nod,
a smile, a word of acknowledgement carried hidden layers of meaning, judgment and expectation.
Any misstep, even accidental, risked social censure or moral implication, and the knight's worn body made each action a conscious effort, each bow a negotiation between will, pain, and obligation. He found the repetition both physically and mentally draining, a loop that extended endlessly, compressing the hours into a continuous blur of effort, ritual, observation, and internalized pressure. The hours passed slowly, marked by the rhythm of ceremonial observances and the unending demands of superstition. Each gesture, prayer, and meal reinforced the oppressive continuity of life in the castle, a cycle of duty, ritual, expectation, and fatigue. The knight's body ached, in constant reminder of age and exertion. Joints stiff and muscles sore, yet the mind was equally burdened, weighed down by calculation, awareness of scrutiny, and the abstract gravity of tradition. Even the light of day seemed indifferent to the passage of time within the stone walls, diffusing softly without offering warmth or relief, bathing the knight and all who moved within the castle in a languid, soporific glow that seemed to extend the sense of weariness and monotony. As night approached, the chapel emptied, candles guttered and flickered, shadows lengthening across the walls. The knight returned to his quarters slowly, each step deliberate, joints and muscles protesting. Armor, garments, and ritual objects were restored to their designated places with meticulous care, a mechanical repetition that mirrored the broader rhythm of his life. He sat for a moment in silence, body tense yet exhausted, mind occupied with reflection on the ritual, the superstition, the ceaseless expectations, and the inescapable loop that had consumed centuries of nights before him and would continue to ensnare generations to come. In this long evening solitude, he contemplated the absurdity and weight of his existence, devotion entwined with fear, ritual intertwined with exhaustion, superstition entwined with social observation. Each day, each act, each motion carried significance, yet that significance was often abstract, heavy, and ultimately soporific. The knight closed his eyes for a moment, the silence enveloping him like a slow, steady pressure, and he felt the simultaneous release and oppression of surrendering to the endless cycle, the monotonous weight and the dull ache of a life spent in the meticulous, burdensome observance of religion, superstition, and ceremony. Chapter 11. Financial Realities. The first light of day crept weakly through the narrow castle windows, touching the cold stone floor and the polished surfaces of ancient furniture with a pallid, almost indifferent glow, and the knight rose from his bed, muscles stiff, back aching, joints groaning in quiet protest, his body reminding him of every year spent in relentless training, endless marches, and ceremonial obligations that had accumulated silently in the marrow of his bones, leaving him now to bear the invisible weight of decades of labor, repetition, and honor that had long since become hollow. Each movement from the bed to the floor was calculated, deliberate, a negotiation between desire for action and the inevitable resistance of an aging, overworked body, muscles stiff, skin sensitive to the chill of the morning air, and bones creaking with subtle complaints that only he seemed to hear. Armor and clothing, polished and arranged with ritualistic precision, awaited him, each piece a symbol not only of his past accomplishments, but of the ongoing obligations imposed by tradition, expectation, and status. Dressing became a lengthy exercise in endurance, each fastening of strap and buckle a reminder that the body once supple and strong now obeyed reluctantly, each motion slower, more deliberate, and tinged with discomfort, a mechanical ritual of presentation and preparation for the day to come. The knight's mind, heavy with fatigue even before the tasks began, turned immediately to the practical realities that underscored every aspect of life in the castle: finances. Despite the apparent grandeur, wealth was measured, distributed with meticulous care, and subject to constant scrutiny. Every coin accounted for, every ration calculated, every expense justified against the unyielding ledger of necessity. The knight's mornings were filled with the silent, deliberate work of calculation, reviewing inventories, tallying supplies, inspecting ledgers, and checking the correspondence of recorded expenditures against the physical realities of stockpiles and stores. The process was tedious, each entry requiring concentration, careful verification, and the endurance of a mind fatigued not only by age, but by the persistent, numbing repetition of figures, lists, and accounts that seemed to stretch endlessly into the hours. He handled documents with deliberate care, quill scratching over parchment, numbers and sums recorded with a meticulous hand, each stroke imbued with the silent authority of adherence to rules whose complexity had grown with centuries of accumulation. Miscalculation, oversight, or error could invite quiet reprimand, social disfavor, or subtle questioning of competence. And the knight, acutely aware of the weight of both tradition and social expectation, executed every task with painstaking attention. His body ached from long hours of seated vigilance. The stiffness of back and neck deepened with each passing minute, muscles fatigued from tension, joints groaning with the stress of sustained posture. Yet the work demanded absolute precision, every mark, tally, and annotation carrying weight beyond the immediate numbers. Supplies and inventories were organized and checked repeatedly. Barrels of grain, sacks of flour, containers of preserved meat, jugs of wine, casks of water, tools, weapons, armor, and the myriad items necessary for the daily functioning of a castle sustained by centuries-old routines and ceremonial maintenance. The knight measured, compared, recorded and verified, aware that even minor discrepancies could have consequences, not merely practical but symbolic, reflecting on his honor, diligence, and adherence to the unspoken codes of responsibility that framed the lives of those in his position. Each item handled carried the silent weight of ritual expectation, the repetition of checking, weighing, and cross-referencing, extending the day into an almost hypnotic sequence of activity that dulled the senses while demanding relentless vigilance. Even the distribution of rations followed intricate protocols, portions measured precisely, records updated with scrupulous care, every transfer logged to maintain order and demonstrate diligence. Failure to adhere to these standards could provoke murmurs, scrutiny from superiors, or subtle disapproval from peers. The knight, whose body ached with every motion and whose mind was fatigued by the endless cycle of verification, nonetheless persisted, aware that the maintenance of honor required this tedious,
exhausting attention to detail.
Meals themselves, already ritualized in prior chapters, were now doubly burdened with consideration of rationing, allocation, and the social implications of portioning in accordance with hierarchy, status, and duty. Financial correspondence added further layers of labor. Letters received and sent detailed transactions, debts, obligations, and requests for allocation or movement of goods, each written and responded to with meticulous attention to tone, phrasing, and protocol. Mistakes could invite misunderstanding, dispute, or social disfavor. The knight approached each with painstaking care, the quill scratching slowly, muscles tense, eyes straining over lines of ink that seemed to multiply endlessly, reflecting not only the practical realities of life in the castle, but the unending obligations of tradition, honor, and the absurdly rigid structures of responsibility that shaped every aspect of existence. By midday, the knight's body protested each motion, legs stiff, back aching, shoulders heavy from hours of seated concentration, eyes tired from long focus on scrolls and ledgers, hands cramped from repetitive writing. Yet the work demanded continuation. The precision of records, the allocation of resources, and the verification of accounts could not be delayed. Every decision carried implications, every oversight potential consequences. The monotony of endless calculation, verification, and supervision pressed upon him with the weight of stone walls and centuries of expectation, each action blending seamlessly into the next, the hours slipping by in a slow, measured procession, punctuated only by the mechanical repetition of necessary, but ultimately unfulfilling, work. Evenings offered no respite. Documents needed final checking, supplies recounted, correspondence prepared for delivery, and all actions performed under the strict observance of hierarchy, protocol, and expectation. The knight's body, exhausted from the day's labors, protested at each movement, yet his mind, fatigued and dulled by repetition, continued the cycle, noting discrepancies, correcting errors, and ensuring the seamless continuation of tradition and order. Every tally, every note, every procedural act reinforced the monotony, the exhaustion, and the soporific weight of existence in a castle that demanded both attention and endurance, offering little beyond the faint, mechanical satisfaction of order maintained. The day concluded as it had begun, the knight seated amidst parchments, ledgers, and documents, the candlelight flickering across the stone walls, reflecting his shadow in long, distorted forms that seemed to mirror the fatigue and slow decay of both body and spirit. The relentless mechanical repetition of financial oversight, inventory management, and ceremonial verification had defined another day, its weight pressing into his muscles, bones, and mind alike. In that quiet, oppressive light, he felt the full extent of the monotony, the endless cycle, the physical exhaustion and mental dullness imposed by centuries of accumulated tradition, responsibility and ritual, and understood with a slow, sinking awareness that honor, diligence, and duty, however meticulously maintained, could never mitigate the ceaseless weight of existence, the soporific rhythm of repetition, and the inexorable erosion of vitality that marked every day in the castle. Chapter 12. Career Decline. The days pressed upon him with the same unrelenting weight they had carried for decades, each sunrise bringing the mechanical repetition of duties,
Obligations and ceremonial obligations that,
while once a source of pride, now pressed upon him like the heavy stones of the castle itself. His body, once agile and strong, responded sluggishly to commands of motion that had formerly been instinctive.
muscles that had once remembered precise movements and exact timing now hesitated, joints stiff and uncooperative, and the echo of fatigue reverberated through every limb with even the smallest exertion.
Dressing in his armor required prolonged effort, each strap and buckle demanding careful alignment and deliberate manipulation. The once fluid motions now reduced to an exercise in endurance and patience, each action a reminder of what had been lost to age, repetition, and the inexorable march of time. Training sessions, which in earlier years had brought satisfaction and a measure of competitive thrill, now emphasized his decline more than any achievement. He moved deliberately through the motions of swordplay, lance handling, and shield maneuvers, each step and swing calculated to avoid pain rather than to achieve prowess. Young knights, their bodies unencumbered by years of repetition, observed with subtle, perhaps unconscious, acknowledgement of his slowing reflexes, the reduced speed and precision of his movements. This recognition, though never overtly hostile, added to the suffocating weight of awareness that the knight carried with him through each hour, a constant reminder that he no longer held the mastery that had once defined him, that his skill, once honed to precision, now labored beneath the inevitable erosion imposed by age and fatigue. Public ceremonies became stages where the contrast between youth and age, vigor and weariness was starkly evident. Each parade, each presentation of arms, each demonstration of skill exposed the limitations that had crept inexorably over the years. The knight, once a figure of admiration and envy, now appeared slow, deliberate, and, in moments of unguarded honesty, painfully aware of his own diminished capacity. His body, carrying the accumulated strain of years of exertion, protested every movement, every extended arm, every measured bow, while his mind, fatigued from constant vigilance and adherence to protocol, struggled to maintain the outward semblance of competence and authority. Even simple interactions with peers and juniors highlighted the steady erosion of his presence. Words of advice, once delivered with confident authority, now required careful phrasing, measured pacing, and repeated reinforcement to convey meaning. Gestures intended to instruct or demonstrate skill demanded planning and effort that had not been necessary in his youth. Each engagement, whether physical, verbal, or ceremonial, underscored the contrast between past capability and present limitation, reinforcing an awareness of decline that weighed heavily upon both body and mind. Battles, though increasingly rare, served as reminders of physical limitations and the impossibility of reclaiming former glory. Each engagement demanded stamina, speed, and precision, yet the knight's body resisted such exertion. Even the simplest defensive maneuvers required calculated effort, while offensive strikes, once fluid and decisive, now relied upon strategy, positioning, and timing more than raw strength or instinctive mastery. The exhilaration of combat, once a source of pride and affirmation, was muted by the awareness of restriction, the constant calculation of effort against capacity, and the subtle, persistent ache of an aging, overused body. Administrative duties, equally unavoidable, imposed further strain, organizing training schedules, overseeing younger knights, managing equipment and armory, and maintaining records of skill and performance became extensions of labor that required mental acuity, meticulous attention to detail, and the relentless maintenance of ceremonial form. Each task, though outwardly structured and predictable, compounded exhaustion, reinforcing the perception of an inexorable decline. Mental fatigue mirrored physical fatigue, each decision, notation, and evaluation a drain upon the mind already dulled by repetition and years of regimented life. Ceremonial displays of rank and responsibility, once occasions of pride, now accentuated the gap between perception and reality. The knight's movements, gestures, and expressions constrained by protocol revealed limitations in speed, strength, and endurance. Social observations by peers and juniors, though subtle, communicated awareness of his declining presence, each nod, glance, and acknowledgement reflecting recognition of reduced vitality. Even the routines of courtesy, respect, and adherence to ritual, so deeply ingrained, required greater effort than previously necessary, and each compliance with expectation exacted a toll on an already weary body. Reflections during quiet moments highlighted the psychological impact of decline. The knight recognized the inevitability of aging, the erosion of skill, and the futility of attempting to reclaim former abilities. Yet the rigid codes of honor, social expectation, and personal pride demanded continued participation, engagement, and demonstration of competence. Fatigue, both corporeal and mental, became constant companions, a shadow in every movement, word, and thought. Each day's labor reinforced the slow, relentless erosion of mastery, the inescapable truth that physical decline was unavoidable, and the ceremonial, ritualistic, and social obligations of knighthood allowed no reprieve. Evening brought no true relief. The knight retired to his chamber with deliberate slowness, joints aching, muscles stiff, mind heavy with reflection. Armor and weapons were removed and carefully stored, garments adjusted and arranged with meticulous care. The weight of the day, accumulated over years, pressed upon him as he settled into the quiet of solitude, yet the mind remained occupied with calculations, responsibilities, and the inexhaustible list of ceremonial duties still awaiting attention. Sleep, when it came, was deep but restless, punctuated by the awareness of another day soon to begin, another round of labor, obligation, and the endless demonstration of honor and duty in a body that no longer moved with its former grace. The knight's career, once a source of pride and identity, now existed largely as memory, ritual, and obligation. Every day, every task, every gesture highlighted decline, reinforced fatigue, and reminded him of the inexorable passage of time. The sharpness of youth had dulled into careful deliberation. Instinct had been replaced by calculation, fluidity by measured motion. Yet despite the accumulation of weariness, pain, and diminished skill, he continued, compelled by tradition, honor, and the silent insistence of expectation, performing the duties of knighthood in a body and mind increasingly governed by fatigue, repetition, and decline. Chapter 13. old age, the passage of years was written upon his body in subtle and unrelenting ways, a chronicle of effort, repetition, and ritual etched into bones, muscles, and sinews, each movement now a negotiation between desire and the persistent reminders of physical decline. Morning light, when it finally filtered through the narrow, high windows, cast long, pale streaks across the chamber floor, illuminating the scattered tokens of a life defined by duty. Worn armor polished to ceremonial gleam, racks of swords, shields marked with dents and scratches, and garments folded with meticulous precision, each piece a silent testament to both the achievements of youth and the erosion of vigor that time had enforced. Rising from bed became a protracted exercise, muscles stiff and uncooperative, joints creaking in a symphony of protest, and each step toward the day's duties felt weighted, not merely by the tangible burden of armor or clothing, but by the accumulated fatigue of decades of physical exertion, long marches, relentless training, and the ceaseless repetition of ceremonial gestures and duties that had marked his life. The castle itself, vast and cold, seemed to emphasize the slow decay of vitality. Corridors stretched endlessly. Halls echoed with the distant footsteps of others, some young and energetic, others similarly slowed by age or the relentless monotony of their roles, yet all movements were underlined by the invisible, omnipresent expectation of tradition and decorum. He moved with deliberate care, aware that each gesture, turning a corner, ascending a staircase, bowing to appear, required calculated effort, a negotiation between skeletal frailty, muscular fatigue, and the imperatives of ritualized behavior. Each action reinforced the persistent gnawing awareness of decline, the impossibility of returning to former capabilities, and the quiet, oppressive weight of social expectation that accompanied every movement. Meals,
once a brief respite or a moment of satisfaction,
had become exercises in endurance and patience. Each portion measured, every utensil placed precisely, gestures performed with mechanical precision to honor hierarchy, tradition, and invisible codes of propriety. Chewing, swallowing, even lifting a cup or passing a plate demanded careful attention. The muscles of hands and arms protesting, joints stiff with age. Yet the necessity of correctness compelled adherence. Conversations during these meals were equally taxing. Words weighed for tone and content, gestures considered for propriety and alignment with social expectation. Every nod and smile a calculated act, all performed while navigating the fatigue of body and mind. Each movement and thought layering upon another to create a sensation both exhausting and soporific. The knight's interactions with younger knights and novices were fraught with subtle tensions. He offered instruction and guidance, yet each demonstration required preparation and effort far beyond that which would have been necessary in youth. Movements that once flowed naturally now demanded conscious calculation, awareness of every joint, muscle, and breath. Verbal instruction, once delivered with the ease of experience, now required repeated clarification, measured pacing, and careful monitoring of reception. Despite this, he persisted, compelled by duty, honor, and the rigid social hierarchy that framed every action, each gesture a silent assertion of continued relevance in a world that increasingly emphasized youth.
agility and novelty battles and training,
though less frequent than in his prime, revealed the stark reality of decline. The knight executed maneuvers with deliberate caution, calculating each step, each strike, each defensive motion, aware that the reflexes of youth had been replaced by measured effort and strategic consideration. The exhilaration of combat, once a source of affirmation, now intertwined with the constant awareness of limitation, fatigue, and the persistent ache of aging muscles. Victory, when achieved, was bittersweet, carrying with it not pride, but the quiet acknowledgement that skill had been supplanted by endurance and calculation. That achievement now rested upon careful management of diminishing physical capacity rather than instinctive mastery. ceremonial duties compounded this fatigue. Parades, presentations, inspections, and religious observances required long hours of standing, walking, bowing, and formal acknowledgement. Each gesture, each bow, each nod of recognition exacted a toll on an already weary body. Muscles burned with prolonged exertion, joints stiffened with repeated movement, and the mind, dulled by repetition, struggled to maintain focus and precision. The interplay of physical exhaustion and mental strain created a sensation of constant, pervasive weariness, a soporific monotony that seemed to extend the passage of time into an endless blur. Even in solitude, the knight felt the weight of age and obligation. Nights were long and restless, muscles aching from the day's labor, joints stiff and sore. Yet the mind occupied with reflection on duties performed, mistakes avoided, and the endless cycle of ritual, obligation, and ceremonial maintenance that continued day after day. Sleep offered respite, but was punctuated by dreams of repetition, failure, and the relentless persistence of social and ceremonial expectation. When morning came, the cycle resumed. The same corridors, the same gestures, the same meals, the same rituals, all performed with deliberate care to maintain appearance, honor, and relevance in a world where both body and capacity had declined. Even simple leisure was infiltrated by fatigue and awareness of limitation. Reading, walking through the gardens, or observing the activities of others demanded attention, calculation, and effort. The body resisted extended motion, the mind resisted prolonged focus, yet the obligations of status and expectation allowed no true retreat from participation. Every movement, every observation, every interaction reinforced the awareness of corporeal and mental decline, the inescapable passage of time and the relentless maintenance of social and ceremonial order. Ultimately, the knight came to accept the constant, oppressive presence of age. Bones creaked, muscles burned, joints ached, and reflexes slowed. Yet he continued, compelled by the structure of life he had always known. Honor and duty, though increasingly abstract and burdensome, demanded adherence. The castle, with its cold stones, echoing halls, and relentless routines, provided both structure and unyielding reminder of the monotony and weight of years endured. As evening fell, shadows lengthened across walls lined with armor, weapons and tapestries, reflecting the knight's own slow, inexorable decline, a testament to the unrelenting passage of time and the inescapable reality that age would eventually consume strength, vitality, and independence, leaving only the weight of memory, ritual, and obligation to mark a life once filled with action, vigor, and achievement.